All right, I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to EVP's Executive Director and Founder, Nathaniel Stinnett.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. And thank you for everybody for joining us this evening. We are going to stick to schedule. This is an hour-long briefing, and we promise to get you out on time. And so what the next now 59 minutes are going to look like is I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, why we do it, and how we do it, with just a little bit of our results. Please forgive me if this is old hat to some of you, and please forgive me if it's not enough detail and information for some of you. We're trying to thread that needle where we're not giving a grand introduction to everything the Environmental Voter Project does, while also giving you a little piece of it for those of you who are new to us. But what we really want to leave time for is the second and third parts. The second part is Danielle is going to go through some of our Austin-specific data with you, the environmental voters and low propensity environmental voters we've identified in Austin, as well as some of our mobilization opportunities. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A session. And so again, for those of you who are just joining us, if you have questions, please put them in that Q&A folder. Danielle or I will either answer them in the Q&A folder, or we'll hold on to them and address them towards the end in the Q&A portion. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And we'll get going. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work at the Environmental Voter Project, in a nutshell, we turn non-voting environmentalists into consistent voters. That's it. That's all we do. We identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet aren't voting. And then we use behavioral science-informed campaigns to message to them and turn them into consistent voters. That's it. We identify non-voting environmentalists and turn them into better voters. Now, what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that you might think a typical environmental nonprofit would do. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as it might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about or the environment. In fact, a good way to think about us is we aren't even in the mind-changing business at all. We don't try to change opinions. We don't try to change minds. Instead, what we try to do is change behavior. We are trying to identify the people who don't need their minds changed. We try to identify people who care so much about climate and the environment that it is quite literally their number one priority over all other issues, yet they aren't voting. And so what these people need is that purely behavioral intervention. And so that's what our focus is. And as I'll describe over the next 4 or 5 minutes, we have very good reasons for sticking to this. Well, I was going to say narrow focus. It might not be as narrow as you think, because there's a lot of opportunity here. And we think it's really, really important to get all of these environment first non-voters to start voting. All right. One of the biggest reasons we focus on this particular area can be seen in this poll right in front of you. And although this is a poll of likely voters in battleground states for last year's midterms, I promise you, it's not unlike pretty much any poll of likely voters that you would see anywhere, whether it's for a municipal election or a presidential race, whether it was in Idaho or Texas or Massachusetts. Whenever you poll likely voters anywhere, and you ask them what their number one issue priority is, almost none of them list climate or the environment. In this particular poll, as you'll see, only 4% of likely voters in battleground states last year listed climate or some other environmental issue as a top priority. Now, the good news is that's better than we would have seen in, say, 2018 and certainly in the 2014 midterms. But the bad news is that is nowhere near where we need it to be. And I think it is so important for those of us in the climate movement to be honest with ourselves that we simply do not have enough political power right now. And I know that's hard to admit, right? When you're part of an advocacy organization or part of a movement, what you like to do is like pound your chest and say, hey, look how big and strong we are. Well, you know what? We're not strong enough. We're not even close to being strong enough. Because if you are running a campaign or if you are an already elected politician, you are looking at the people who are likely to show up to vote and only 4% of them care about a particular issue, man, is it hard for you as that policymaker, for you as that politician to say, oh, let's spend all our political capital on those people, on that 4%. It is so hard. And when only 4% of likely voters list climate and the environment as their top priority, that means it's not only hard for us to elect climate leaders, it is also hard for those leaders, even when we do elect them, even when we do elect the so-called right people, it's hard for them to justify spending their political capital on something that only 4% list as their top priority. Now, some of you might be looking at this data and saying, oh, I don't get it. Like I see all these polls that say, 70% of Americans want the government to address climate change, or 60% want government action on clean air or clean water. No, that's true. That's true. But there's an enormous difference between voter preferences and voter priorities. A whole lot of people would prefer government action on climate change, but it is nowhere close to one of their top priorities. And that is what's important, issue salience, not issue support, but issue salience. And I'll give you an example. My guess is that 80% of Americans want to get rid of daylight savings time. Maybe many of you are among them. That doesn't mean that the presidential election is going to be decided on the issue of whether to get rid of daylight savings time. The mere fact that lots of people want something doesn't mean that that thing is important to them. And right now, we are living in a moment in time where there are a whole bunch of people who would prefer government action on climate change and environmental issues, but it is not a political priority of theirs. And that's a big, big problem. And the reason it is such a big problem is because of this. And if there is only one thing that you remember from this first portion of our presentation this evening, please let it be what I'm about to say. Who you vote for is secret. I think a lot of people know that. But whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And so what that means when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it is, well, you know what? Let me give you an example. Let's say Danielle, my colleague who lives in Austin, let's say Danielle decides to run for governor of Texas. And for better or for worse, Danielle, you've hired me to be your campaign manager. Maybe you don't have enough money to hire someone else. But okay, I'm Danielle's campaign manager. She's running for governor. Danielle for governor. This is the first meeting that we have. And it's the first meeting that anybody has on any campaign for anything. There's our gubernatorial candidate, Danielle. Yay. It goes like this. We open up our laptops. We look at public voter files and we say, oh, okay, here are a whole bunch of people who aren't even registered to vote. Forget them. We're going to ignore them. Oh, here are some people who are registered to vote, but they never actually do. They never actually cast ballots. Going to forget them too. Oh, here are people who are registered to vote, but they only vote in presidentials. Texas gubernatorials align with a midterm election calendar. So I'm probably not going to talk to the presidential only voters either. Oh, here are some people who vote in midterms and gubernatorials. Yeah, we'll talk to them. Oh, and here are ones who even show up in local elections. Let's definitely talk to them too. And not to put too fine a point on it, folks, but we literally know who these people are by name and street address. By name and street address. This is how most campaigns are run. They know who votes and they know who doesn't vote. And when you are trying to win an election and you literally know by name and street address who votes and who doesn't vote, who do you think the Danielle for Governor campaign is going to bother talking to? Not the people who have proven over and over again that they never bother to vote. They're going to spend their time and money talking to people who do vote. Maybe if they are loaded with cash, then they'll go to people who are less likely to vote, but only with their last few dollars. And so if campaigns mostly, not always, but mostly target likely voters, well, who do you think they poll? They only poll those likely voters too. And I know this this sounds cynical. I haven't been doing this for so long that I can't hear how cynical that is. But like, the simple truth is that like politicians don't care about the priorities of people who don't vote. They only care about the priorities of voters. And that's not terribly different from a whole lot of other things in modern life. Like, would you expect Ford Motor Company to care about people who don't buy cars? No, they market their cars to car drivers, just like politicians market themselves and their campaigns to people who vote. The only difference is Ford doesn't have a list of every single potential car buyer, whereas politicians literally have in public voter files lists of the people who vote and the lists of people who don't vote. And so the reason I took us on this little detour is this is why polls like this that I just showed you are such bad news for the environmental movement. Because voters, when you look at voters, very, very few of them list climate or the environment as their top priority. And so when you are running for governor or when you are running for president or even when you're running for dog catcher, there aren't that many voters who say, yeah, I want you to lead on climate and the environment. All right. Why am I bringing up all of this when trying to introduce you to the Environmental Voter Project? Well, like a lot of nonprofits, we are trying to solve a problem. And in particular, the problem we are trying to solve is this: the fact that there is far too little political demand for climate leadership. And the really interesting thing is this: the reason there are far too few voters demanding climate leadership turns out to be not because there are too few Americans who want climate leadership. In fact, if instead of looking at a poll of all likely voters, we broadened the aperture and looked at many, many more people, like all registered voters, or maybe all adults, you would see that there are enormous numbers of them who do list climate or the environment as a top priority. And so what we've come to realize at the Environmental Voter Project is that the environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. It turns out that there are tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists out there. The problem is they just aren't voting. They just aren't voting. And this gets to the core of what I started off by telling you this evening, which is why the Environmental Voter Project focuses on just finding these environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters. And I realize I just made a very big assertion here, so let me give you some data. In that same poll that I was alluding to earlier that looked at battleground states in the 2022 midterms, if you drill down on, say, some big battleground states here, like, say, Nevada, Only 5% of likely voters in Nevada said that when choosing a candidate, climate change was the single most important factor. But then when you looked at the registered voters in Nevada who were unlikely to vote, so the ones that skipped midterms, it was twice as many, 10%. Let's take another state, Pennsylvania. Only 3% of likely voters for last year's midterm in Pennsylvania said climate was the number one thing when choosing a candidate. But 7% of the unlikely voters did. This is a problem that we must confront in the climate movement. All of our people are sitting on the sidelines. And I'm not claiming that it is unimportant to try to change people's minds. Obviously, it's a really good thing to try to convince voters to care more about climate. But what we'd like to suggest to you is that the far greater opportunity is with all of these people who don't need their minds changed. They're already with us. They just aren't voting. Because we live in a moment in time where it's become excruciatingly hard to change people's opinions about anything, especially climate change. And what all these people down here represent are people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not. But it is easier than changing people's minds. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper. All right. And so before I get into very quickly going over how we do that, how we find these people and then change their behavior and some of our results, I just want to give you one more slide defining the size of this opportunity that we have. When we looked back at previous even years or federal elections nationwide, you can see there are an enormous number of already registered voters. These are already registered voters who list climate or other environmental issues as their top priority, yet don't vote. Over 8 million in the 2020 presidential election. 13 million, hair above 13 million in last year's midterms. And I'm going to get into very briefly, forgive me, only very briefly, how we're able to identify these people. But this is the size of the opportunity that we're trying to address at the Environmental Voter Project. And it's a webinar, so I can't see all of your faces, but I imagine some of you are looking at these numbers and you're like, oh my God, this many environmentalists aren't voting. And I understand, I share your frustration, but for a second, I'd like you to not be frustrated and instead understand how big an opportunity this is. These are people who aren't only with us. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. Like, it is their number one priority. They're already registered to vote. And they just need that nudge to turn them into better voters. This is the opportunity we're trying to take advantage of, not only in Austin, but throughout Texas and throughout the United States. Okay, very, very quickly, I want to quickly go through how we do this, what some of our results are, and then hand it off to Danielle for the Austin-specific data. We use a 4-step process at the Environmental Voter Project. Again, forgive me that I'm going to breeze over this, but this is not like an intro to EVP, 101 session here. First, we individually identify these voters. And the way this works is we build predictive models on voter files. For those of you who are in the campaign world, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who aren't, very briefly, what I mean by this is we poll enormous numbers of people, tens of thousands of people. And we only ask them one question: what's your number one most important political priority? Let's say in Texas, 1,000 people out of 10,000 say climate change, clean air, clean water. We then work with data scientists to isolate those 1,000 people and say, okay, well, what do we know about these 1,000 people who just self-identified as climate first voters? What data is there on voter files? What census data is there? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data is there? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot out there. And we start learning some really rich interesting, nuanced information about these people who just told us they were climate first voters. And then what these data scientists start doing is they say, I wonder if we can find other Texans like them. Here's a whole group of people who said climate is their number one priority. And I wonder if we can find other like suburban Latino grandmothers who bought a Volvo between 3 and 5 years ago and subscribed to National Geographic because they seem to really like climate, care about climate change. Oh, and here's another group, and here's another cluster, and here's another cluster. And it's a long iterative process. But at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single individual voter in the Texas voter file, telling us how likely they are to list climate as their number one priority. And I know it sounds like a complicated, nuanced process, and it is kind of. But at the end of the day, it's actually not that different from like an insurance company building an actuarial table, right? If you've ever applied for life insurance, the first thing you do is you say, here's my age, here's my health history, here's how much I drink, here's how much I smoke. No, I don't like jump off cliffs or dive out of airplanes. Like you give them all this data that allows them to build a risk profile for you and then compare it to all these other people. And not to get too morbid, but like they need to figure out how long you're going to live and sell you a policy based on that. And if they're wrong, like the whole global economy crashes. So they need to be really good at it. Well, we're doing the same thing, only we're not trying to identify how long these people are going to live. We're trying to use all of this data and all of our survey responses to figure out who the super environmentalists are. All right. Remember what I told you is the one thing that you can't forget from my portion of the presentation? Whether you vote or not is public record. So once we identify these super environmentalists, it's then real easy for us to just say, okay, let's get rid of all the good voters and focus on the bad voters. That's when we move to step number 2. We work with thousands of volunteers around the country to canvass, call, mail, and send digital ads to these voters. We don't just do it in the big sexy elections. We do it year round. That's what step number 3 is, habit reinforcement. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that if you want to change people's voting behavior, you can't just talk to them every 2 years when there's a big election going on. You have to use every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. And so we test hundreds of messages each year with what's called randomized control trials. They're like the gold standard for behavioral science experiments. And we optimize our messages for different subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists. And the ones that don't work, we get rid of. The ones that do work, we reinforce. And ultimately, step 4, we want to change the electorate. We want to get to a point where anybody who is running for anything will look at the voter file or look at their polls of likely voters and say, holy moly, where did all these environmentalists come from? Because when we're able to do that, not only will we change the types of people we elect, but no matter whom we elect, they're going to be much more likely to spend their political capital on climate change and environmental issues than some other issue. Because again, even when we elect the so-called right person, boy, is it hard to expect them to say, hey, I'm going to spend all my political capital on this thing that only 4% of likely voters cares about. Let's do that. Man, that's asking for a lot of courage from politicians. And I don't want to depend on politicians being courageous in doing the right thing. No, at the Environmental Voter Project, we want to depend on politicians wanting to win elections. That's the only thing I'm willing to bet on, is that they all like to win elections. And so it's incumbent upon us to build up so much political power that we scare the bejesus out of anybody running for office and make them think, if I want to win, I got to give these environmentalists what they want. All right, just to give you a snapshot of what we did last year, we were active in these 17 states. Now we're in 19 states. We added Louisiana and Nebraska. Over the last 4 years in randomized control trials, we have been solely responsible for increasing turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in big general elections, as much as 3.6 in primaries, and as much as 4.0 percentage points in local elections. And just to be clear, what a randomized control trial is we set aside about 20% of our targets and don't talk to them. And then after the election, we compare turnout among the people we did talk to those we didn't. And what that allows us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. The Biden campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing voters in Pennsylvania. Doesn't matter. We controlled for that. Unless they hacked into our system and only targeted people in our treatment group and not our control group, we controlled for that. These are the results that we're able to get when we're able to just focus on this one group of people, and perhaps more importantly, only focus on changing their behavior and not having to worry about issue education or convincing them to care more about climate and the environment. And perhaps more importantly, because remember, our ultimate goal is to change the electorate. We've now been doing this work for almost 7 years. For a little bit more than 7 years. Since we launched at the end of 2015, we have now communicated with over 9.5 million unique Environment First registered voters, all of whom were pretty awful voters, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? Well, as of last February, as of this most recent February, we could see in voter files that almost 1.5 million of them had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election, including over 150,000 of the low propensity environmental voters in Texas that we have been targeting. Now, unlike a randomized control trial, I can't claim that we're solely responsible for these numbers. This is not a randomized control trial for many reasons. Running multi-year randomized control trials is hard. So I can't claim that only EVP is responsible for making 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. But we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other group that's been active in over 1,900 elections over the last 7 years. Just to give you some context for what these numbers mean, 109,000 super voters, new super voters in Arizona, that's over 10 times the presidential margin in Arizona. All right. This is what we do at the Environmental Voter Project, why we do it, how we do it, and some of our results. We have decided to focus our efforts. Oh, and here's some nice things that people say about us. I'll skip over that. We have decided to focus our canvassing efforts in 3 places, and only 3 places at the moment: Tucson, Arizona, Austin, Texas, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Out of all of the 19 states that we're in and all of the thousands of municipalities we're in, these are the 3 places we've decided to canvass, simply because there is an absurd number, not only of non-voting environmentalists in these 3 municipalities, but canvassable ones. People whose doors we can reach, and they're really, really close together. And so Danielle's going to start talking now, and she's going to give you some of the granular data about how many of these canvassable low propensity environmentalists we've identified in Austin, because I tell you guys, it's a huge opportunity. We are like super, super excited about Austin.
Thank you, Nathaniel. And yes, as he mentioned, we're now going to start taking a look at our work in Austin over the past couple of years before we dig into the data. And again, I'm so excited to be part of this event because I live here in Austin. And as you can see here, I just want to shout out this photo is of some volunteers from a canvass that happened earlier this year in April when we were canvassing for the May 6th election. And I believe Marie, who's in the photo, is here today. So thank you for joining us, Marie. Yes, so we have been active in Austin since April 2021. And since then, I had to double check this. There have been, since we became active in Austin, in Texas, there have been 9 elections in Austin since April 2021. That is a lot. And it's a big reason, in addition to the canvassable and high number of canvassable targets here, it's another big reason that we are canvassing here in Austin, because it certainly gives us plenty of opportunities to help improve the voting behavior of these environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. So it's that habit reinforcement, gives us more opportunities to talk with them face to face. So to sum up some of the information highlighted here, in addition to canvassing, we phone bank, send direct mail, and deliver digital ads to our Austin voters. In Austin, we have called over 19,000 of our low propensity environmental voter targets. We've sent direct mail to over 15,000 targets, and we excuse me, so sorry, I got distracted by the chat. And we've targeted more than 151,000 of our targets with digital ads. And yes, thank you so much again to the volunteers who joined us earlier this year for canvassing here in Austin. Next slide, please. So now we're going to take a look at the data of our Austin targets. Here is, in this map, here is a look at our canvassing targets for this year. We have nearly 209,000 canvassable targets here in Austin, and every dot on this map represents a household with 1 or more low propensity environmental voter. So as you can see, it's pretty dense. We'll zoom in here in just a little bit, but one exciting thing that I wanted to highlight about Austin is that Austin provides some of our densest canvassing turfs in the country, which is pretty astounding since we operate in much denser cities like Boston, where EVP started, where Nathaniel's based. In my old neighborhood here in Austin, for example, there were some streets where all but one house was a target of ours. And if you've canvassed before, if you've volunteered on campaigns and for canvassing, you know that that's pretty unusual. And that's a great turf, makes things very easy. So just to reiterate who our targets are, these are folks who are already registered to vote. They have a very high likelihood of listing climate change or clean air, clean water, and the environment as their #1 priority when voting. And according to the public voter file, they have a history of not voting in local elections or other odd year elections. So they're just showing up for big presidential or midterm elections. And they also are accessible to door-to-door canvassing volunteers, as Nathaniel mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So here is a look at our targets for next year, 2024, which you all likely know is a big presidential election year. So we still have more than 41,000 canvassable environmental voters here. Again, they're registered to vote, highly likely to consider climate and the environment a top priority, and they're accessible to door-to-door canvassing. The difference between these targets and our current 2023's targets is these folks are the folks that did not vote in 2022 for the presidential election year. They didn't vote last year, and they haven't voted in any other election since 2022, or since 2020, excuse me. And when I say last year, I mean the midterm general election. So as you can see, there are still many targets in Austin for the big presidential election year. And this, I should point out, is our presidential years we're going to have the fewest number of targets for our presidential years, because people mostly vote, more people turn out to vote for our presidential elections, as Nathaniel mentioned. Next slide, please. So here we are zooming in a bit, just to give you an example of a closer look at District 9 for this year, 2023. We have more than 42,000 targets in District 9. for this year. And this includes the neighborhood I mentioned earlier, where we found streets where almost every house has a target. Next slide, please. Looking at next year for District 9, we still have over 9,000 targets in this district and a lot of density, especially in that area just west and north of the university. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about how you can get involved in our work. If you're an individual and you're interested in getting involved, you can join us for an already scheduled canvas. We have 3 canvases scheduled in October, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But just to paint a picture of what canvassing with us looks like, we meet up at a designated location, and I provide a full training so that you feel comfortable and make sure you have the opportunity to ask any questions. I provide you with the lit, which I've got right here, some door hangers that you write the election day on, and as well as the voter's name. We'll get into that. If you join us for a canvas, I'll give you the full training. And then we'll be talking then after everyone feels comfortable and everyone's questions are answered. We start going door to door to talk with our targets about upcoming elections. In this case, for our October canvases, we'll be talking about the November 7th statewide election. I'm sure you all already know, but there are going to be 14 propositions on the ballot, and a few of them are related to climate and the environment. So this is definitely a good one to help encourage our targets to vote. We will provide a full script so that you have all of the information and talking points that you need. And as a reminder, we are a nonpartisan organization, so we are not persuading our targets to vote for any particular candidate or proposition. Instead, we're just using behavioral science and social pressure methods to encourage them to make a voting plan. And, I want to acknowledge that some people, canvassing might not be for them. If canvassing isn't the right fit for you, that's okay. We also do phone banking, as I mentioned earlier. This allows you to call and talk with our targets from home. And again, we provide a full training and a script for that as well. So if you're nervous and you kind of want to test the waters with mobilizing our targets, this might be a good starting point, a good way to test the waters. And then once you see it's not so scary, it's fun, and we have a good time with it, and then maybe that's when you consider moving on to canvassing. Another option, if you are an organizer or you have a community network and you'd like to lead your own canvas or phone bank, we can talk about that too. Just be sure to take down my email, which you can find at the bottom of the screen here. You can take a screenshot or write it down and get in touch, and we can discuss some options. The other option, if you are with an organization, I believe we have some CCL folks here. Of course, you and your org can join us for any of the things that I've already mentioned, the scheduled canvases, the scheduled phone banks, but we can also offer voter analysis data, or even the opportunity to partner for canvassing events if that's of interest. As a partner, you can, this is optional, but you can even put your own spin on it. In Tucson, Arizona, one of our other canvassing hubs, we partner with Tucson Audubon Society. And really cool, they offer birding for volunteers before canvassing. Nathaniel likes to call us nerds, but I think birding is really, really cool. And I think we've got some fellow birders in this event tonight. So if that's of interest, we could make that happen, but it doesn't have to be birding. We are open to all sorts of ideas. It could be gardening, it could be painting, even yoga. I mean, really, we can pair it with any kind of activity that might help, give the volunteers an opportunity to get to know each other before or even after the canvas. We can get creative with it. Another option, if you're an organization and you have events that you need help promoting that are relevant to our work at EVP, we can help promote it. Or if you have something else entirely in mind, then that's okay, and we haven't talked about it. let me know. Again, take down my email and we can discuss some potential ways that we can collaborate. And next slide, please. So like I said, we have 3 canvases scheduled for October. The first one will take place in the Brentwood and Crestview neighborhoods. And the other 2 are still undecided. And I should say the Brentwood and Crestview neighborhoods, there's so much density there. Talking again about the streets where I found at least a few streets where it's almost in every house on a street is a target of ours. Unheard of. I have to double check and make sure that there's not an error, but the data director and I reassured that's just how dense our turfs are here. The other 2 locations for October 21st and the 28th are still up in the air. So if you have a preference on an area, we're open to suggestions. As long as we have density of our targets in an area, we can make it happen. And then, of course, looking to the future, we'll definitely be canvassing and phone banking voters for the March 5th primary. So please feel free to reach out if you're interested in getting involved in any of those efforts. And next slide, please. Again, even larger this time, take down my email, take a screenshot, get in touch. I'm happy to, even if you have questions or you think it's not relevant and we don't get to it tonight, yeah, happy to discuss any way that we can work together. And thank you so much. I'll hand things back to Nathaniel.
Thank you, Danielle. And I hope all of you realize, looking at those maps, why it is that we are so focused on Austin, Texas. Again, I know Danielle mentioned this, but it bears repeating. If any of you have ever worked on a campaign before or volunteered for a campaign or knocked on doors, you're not used to seeing what's called canvassable density like this. There are so many environment first non-voters or low propensity voters in Austin. And not only are there so many, but they are reachable, right? In some places, they're not reachable, right? Like they live up in a high rise in New York City, or they're in gated communities. Well, not in Austin. We can reach them. And so please, we would love to have you join us on canvases. Please go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. And I think we'll be putting that link in the chat. But please sign up for these canvases. Sign up for the first canvas so that we can see you there. Or if you're more interested in doing phone banking or something else, we would love to have you join the phone banks. Oh, I'm sorry, my dog is barking there a little bit. So I think if any of you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. I think we already have some questions ready to go. Danielle, shall we jump into the questions?
Yes. All right. We have one question from an anonymous attendee here in the chat. My demographic of voters is 18 to 23, as I am only 23. Do you offer this information that I can utilize toward people my age? I feel like when I talk to people my age, people just don't think it's cool to vote. My personal business is using this info and turning it into fun action, which is great. We're so happy you're here. And you work in Crestview and Allendale and Hyde Park, far west. Awesome. So Nathaniel, I'll hand that to you.
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say, oh my gosh, and maybe we'll get into this in a little bit later, because I know there was another question asked about this, but oh my gosh, are the environment first voters in Texas really, really young? No, they're really young everywhere, but in Texas, they are really, really young. So you're not alone as a 23-year-old who cares about this. As far as some advice on messaging, and this goes, I'll start general and then get specific. Generally, When you're trying to change someone's behavior, so not change their mind, not change their opinions about something, but change their behavior. So getting them to exercise, getting them to vote, getting them to eat healthy, things like that. The best thing to do is not try to rationally convince them of the importance of voting, but instead try to appeal to them as a social being. So don't view them as a rational being, view them as a social being. What do I mean by that? I realize I'm speaking in like very general terms. Okay, so let's get specific. Yeah, maybe your friends don't want to hear why it's important to vote. Maybe they don't buy it when you try to say, oh, you care about issue X, and so you've got to vote because it's really important for issue X. It doesn't surprise me that that doesn't work. In all of the randomized control trials that we see, that doesn't work either. Instead, what you should do is figure out, what do your friends and peers want to be seen as? How do they want to be viewed as social beings? What do they want their peers to think of them as? And I realize this is like kind of uncomfortable, right? It sounds kind of manipulative. But like, yes, that's the whole point. We are trying to manipulate them. We are trying to change their behavior. And what's really interesting in the way you asked this question was, my friends don't think it's cool to vote. That was very insightful. You probably knew that it was very insightful when you asked the question. Things like that drive behavior far more than our rational decision-making process about whether one person's vote is going to make a difference in an election. So maybe your friends don't think it's cool to vote. Well, what else do they care about being, in addition to being cool? Maybe they care about fitting in. And so you want to use things like peer pressure with your messaging. You want to say, hey, everybody is going to be voting in this upcoming election. Everybody in our dorm room, or everybody in our street, or all of our peer group, or something like that. Another thing that you can do, this is actually a very interesting study that Facebook did like 7 years ago, is simply be loud and proud on your social media channels about the fact that you are a voter. Why? Because we're all social beings. We're all looking to each other for cues as to what is appropriate and correct behavior. And what studies have shown is that your friends will see you on Instagram or Twitter, and they'll say, oh gosh, well, they're an environmental voter. Maybe if I care about the environment, I need to be a voter too. I know that sounds so like simplistic, but it's true. We are obsessively, almost like pathologically social beings who spend every minute of every day figuring out how to present ourselves to the world. And all of your friends are always looking at you for cues about what appropriate behavior is. So really, on social media, be loud and proud about being a voter. The final suggestion that I'll make, the third one, is Danielle mentioned briefly the idea of social pressure messaging. In a very general sense, what social pressure messaging is, and you see it a lot in the voter turnout space, is we try to figure out what are the social norms that people might buy into, and how can we leverage that? How can we use that to change their behavior? And there are a whole lot of social norms, right? People want to be thought of as smart, or people want to be thought of as this or that. People want to be thought of as good voters. Well, one societal norm that almost anybody buys into is most people want to be thought of as honest. They want to be thought of as promise keepers. It's seen as a good thing to be an honest person. So how can you use that with your fellow 23-year-olds to get them to vote? Ask them, whenever you think it's appropriate, whether they intend to vote or not. It can be a year ahead of time. You ask them now whether they're going to vote in the 2024 election. And then you can come back to them right before the election and say, hey, I just want to remind you, you said that you were going to vote. And next Tuesday is your opportunity to follow through on that promise. Now, instead of trying to convince them that, as you asked in your question, that voting is cool, or trying to convince them that their one vote is going to make a difference over a denominator of like 11 million voters in Texas. No, now you've got something much easier going on. Now you are equating the act of voting with whether they're an honest person who keeps their promises or not. And we've got the receipts on our website. Go to the results tab. You can see study after study shows that that's a really powerful way to turn non-voters into new voters and new voters into consistent voters. Simply asking them if they're going to vote. When they say yes, it's like a trap closing on them, because then you can come back and remind them of that promise. So those are the 3 suggestions.
Such a great speaker, Nathaniel. So well put. So well, and yeah, it's great. We've got a couple more questions, and then I have one that I want to add as well. A question from Marie. Thank you so much. She says she's going to sign up right away. That's great. I added the links in the chat, and I'm going to add them again in a little bit more with some more explanation of what link is for what. So my apologies, I got too eager earlier. I want to address your question, or maybe Nathaniel, you want to address the question about postcarding. Do you want to take that one, or do you want me to?
But you go for it.
Okay. We currently don't have any postcard campaigns available for Austin. And I believe we're done. I don't operate our postcarding campaigns, but our postcards, we are done with postcarding for this year, but we do about 4 to 5 or maybe 6 next year postcarding campaigns a year. And you can keep an eye out. I'll put the link in the get involved link in our chat. I'm so sorry. I'm like losing my words here, but yes, so we do postcarding. We didn't talk about that here because we haven't done that for Austin just yet, but we can definitely keep you updated by checking the get involved page. I'm so sorry. That was I made that way more difficult. Nathaniel, did I miss anything?
No, that was it. And we test our postcarding campaigns very rigorously. We are not like a lot of other groups where a lot of other groups do great work, don't get me wrong, but they say, pick your design, pick what you want to say, or things like that. We surprise, surprise, we are very like nerdy and rigorous about it. We say, here is your design. Here is what we want you to say. We give you the addresses. We will pay for stamps for you if you would like. But what we can also tell you is that we have randomized control trials proving that if you do the postcards this way, you will increase turnout. You will increase turnout. And we have the results on our results tab, and you can see. So we know this stuff works. And as Danielle said, if you go and sign up at our Get Involved page to volunteer, we will keep you updated on what the upcoming postcarding campaigns are.
All right, and I just put that link in the chat. Another good question from Nick. What canvassing messages do you use at the doors with voters? I've got a copy of the script that we used for our Austin canvassing from May up, and I can kind of just, read through it. It's pretty simple. So the initial script, and again, I want to reiterate, we provide you with a script, and so that way you have your talking points and there's no pressure. It's not, we've given you the format. So simple as, hi, my name, or hi, is so-and-so available? My name is Danielle, and I'm a volunteer with the Environmental Voter Project. We're a nonpartisan group dedicated to voter turnout. We're talking to folks about the May 6th city election. Can I count on you to vote? And I think some key things there, nonpartisan, that takes the pressure off. Previous canvassing volunteers have shared that makes it easier. And like, I don't want to say tension, but it just eases things, because right away it lets the voter know, okay, they're not trying to persuade me to vote in any which way. And then hopefully the question, can I count on you to vote? The answer is yes. So you say, that sounds great, or that's great. And it sounds like almost all of your neighbors are voting too. That's that social pressure we're talking about, making it seem like, oh, all your neighbors feel the responsibility and they think it's cool and they're voting too, so that's that social pressure. And then we let them know you can vote early or you can vote on election day at your polling place. Can I provide you with more specific information about any of those options, or even the county clerk's website, which we then list on the next page. And we provide all sorts of information so that you can reference it, so that you aren't left standing in the doorway, unclear on, what information to give. And also, if you don't know the answer to the question, if they ask a really random one, that's okay too. You can say, I can get back to you, and you can take their email down and we can follow up with them. And that's great that they would want follow-up information. Yeah, thank you for that great question, Nick. If anyone has more specific questions, wants to see a template of our script, happy to provide that. We'll have the October Canvas script available soon. So I can even just send you that ahead of time if you sign up and you would like to review it and get comfortable with it before. That would be like superstar volunteer status, and not a requirement at all, but we can make that happen. Okay, we've got 3 minutes. Nathaniel, do I have time for one quick question just for myself? Because I think it's always a good question to ask. Who are these environmental voters?
Yes. Okay. So we have a lot of data about who these low propensity environmental voters are nationwide and in specific states. In Texas, probably the best resource is a report that we put out a few months ago called, shorthand, I just refer to it as green voters in red states, but I think it's got a longer, name of that. And so maybe Danielle, you can put that in the link. But these voters are disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately female, and disproportionately lower income. All right, let me drill down in some detail there. The first one, disproportionately young, that's probably not a surprise to any of you. But when I say disproportionately young, oh man, in Texas, these low propensity environment first voters, like they're so much younger than in other states. In other states, maybe 70% of our target audience would be under the age of 35. In Texas, it's 91%. So I think 65% of our targets in Texas are 18 to 24. And then 26 are 26% are age 25 to 34. So like really, really young. Second thing I'll mention, the gender gap in Texas is enormous. Now, I want to be clear. Voter file data lists sex, not gender, so it's really a sex gap. But people identified as female in voter files, I think maybe they're like 53% of registered voters in Texas, but they're 60 or 61% of our targets in Texas. So normally, if you just look at registered voters in Texas, there's like a 6 or 7% gender gap. If you look at our target audience, there's like a 20% gender gap. So women are much, much, much more likely to be low propensity environmental voters than men are. And to be clear, that gender gap has nothing to do with vote propensity. And so we at the Environmental Voter Project are obviously only targeting low propensity environmental voters. But let's say we got rid of that low propensity. We were just looking at environment first voters, that gender gap would still be there. Women are much more likely to care deeply about climate and the environment in all of our states, but particularly in Texas. Last thing that I'll just say is Black voters, Hispanic voters, and AAPI voters are also disproportionately likely to not just care about environmental issues in Texas, but also be low propensity environmental voters in Texas. So those are the three big demographic trends that we see in our target audiences in Texas: disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately female. Additionally, we see disproportionately lower income, but that varies pretty dramatically from municipality to municipality. One final thing that I'll just say on this. There have obviously been a lot of voter suppression problems in Texas lately. Many of you don't need me to tell you this. Whenever there is voter suppression occurring anywhere, the government entity is usually either targeting young people, people of color, or lower income people. 3 of those 4 demographic groups that I just mentioned, we see trends of in our target audience. And so not only is voter turnout very important to the environmental movement, but ballot access is increasingly important to the environmental movement. And I want everybody who cares about climate and environmental issues to start realizing that. We are no longer a movement of like white suburban yuppies driving Priuses. We are a movement of young people of color who are more and more lower income than before. That is the beating heart of the modern environmental movement. And so we really need to start caring about ballot access issues as well. All right, we went 2 minutes over what we said we would. So I'm going to finish things just by saying, like, please, please sign up for door-to-door canvassing with us. Sign up for these phone banks. This is your opportunity to make a difference. We do not ask our volunteers to do anything unless we have a randomized control trial, or preferably multiple randomized control trials, that have proven to us that what the volunteers are doing will work. And by work, I mean increased turnout when compared to a set-aside random control group. I mean, this is really scientifically rigorous research. We are only asking you to do things that we know work. But the bargain is, now you need to kind of do it, right? Like, you are here, you have self-identified as people who care deeply about climate and the environment and care deeply about politics. You are looking for an opportunity, and we are giving it to you. So please join us. Danielle wants to see you at these canvases. We want to see you at these phone banks. We want you to be part of our work. Danielle, did I miss anything?
You covered everything as usual. Thank you so much to Nathaniel for sharing information about EVP, and for all of you for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to be here. We didn't get rain today, which was a surprise in the forecast, but we got this space in this hour, and I'm so grateful for all of you sharing your time with us. And I hope to see you October 7th, 21st, and or 28th.
Have a good night, folks. Bye.